Yeah, there's a couple of faces in here that will remember him. And Antonio and I have stayed...
Yeah, how far they kind of distanced of themselves from myself.
And Antonio and I have stayed in touch over the years, and one of the things that I've always liked about Antonio is his passion and intellect, and his passion around lots of different subjects, but in particular his interest around sustainability, and become an advocate for sustainability and to lobby and to promote the broader agenda. And he thinks of things in a very different way to I do, and looks at it more broadly, which I think is stimulating. So when Antonio came to me and said, could we do a talk and have a bit of a debate around how architecture may need to adapt in the context of, would you say catastrophic change, or would you say the event of climate change, then I thought, great, let's do it. Let's have a debate. So I'm speaking, done the announcements in the beginning because unfortunately I have to leave at 6:30. I'm still in the office, but I've got a meeting I need to attend at 6:30. So please continue with questions, and I apologise if I have to skip out. Shall I leave you to do?
Yes, leave them to me.
Thank you. Oh, I forgot to say, this beer is locally sourced, by the way. So please help yourselves, which is what I'm going to do now.
It is such a pleasure to be back. The first thing I need to share with you is that when I left about 9 years ago, there were about 5 times as many people waiting for me to go. And very few here tonight to see me coming back. So for those who don't remember me, my name is Antonio Pisano. I'm an architect, and I sometimes question whether I actually love my job or not. I think I love it, but I'm not entirely sure. So I worked in this practice for about 5 years, and I was happy. I found purpose, particularly in contributing to key parts of social infrastructures, such as schools and hospitals and housing. And then in the middle of the recession, it was about May 2011, as I was hitting 30, I thought, maybe there should be something else in my life to make it a little bit more challenging. So I resigned, and like Wim Wenders' deranged penguin in Encounters at the End of the World, I left the safety of the pack and ventured into the unknown towards certain death, towards mountains 3,000 miles away. And then a lot of things happened, incredible things. So together with my kind of best friend, I set up a practice called Marcel. Marcel is now active in London, Paris and Milan. As Marcel, we then joined a consortium of about 7 companies working in Europe, Asia and South America. And with them we do far more interesting, more complex work, primarily in regional development, urban development, and urban regeneration. And then it still wasn't quite challenging enough. So together with my wife, we set up a not-for-profit startup focused in sustainable, low-carbon adventure holidays called Z-Crew. But that, it wasn't quite enough. So with a friend of mine who was a programmer, we then raised finance and developed an app to automate project management in the domestic sector for construction. And the app was called Project Easy. But that, wasn't quite enough either. So still with my wife, we then set up another startup focused in the development, delivery and management of conscious, sustainable co-living units in London. And that's called Z-Crew. Sorry, there's space up. I love the holiday more. Space up, indeed. It's about 1 year old and is doing okay. And then as the birth of our firstborn child is getting closer and closer, we think, we need to think 20 years down the line. We need to kind of read the IPCC report, understand what the XR is doing, really understand what's going to happen to European climate in 20, 30 years. As because of that, we are, together with a group of friends as well, we're kind of raising finance and fine-tuning the business case to regenerate a castle on the Italian mountains to create a climate change resilience eco-commune. And for that one, we haven't found a name yet. So, lots of adventures. In all these adventures, I would say the architecture is part of the mix. It's never quite the only aspect in the mix. So that it leaves me wondering, do I actually love my job or not? As much as I am an architect and I work as an architect, I also feel as an environmentalist. And my relationship with the environment is very clear. I belong to biosphere, and I try to act in a corresponding way. Sometimes I just don't feel I belong to architecture as much as I belong to the biosphere. And over the years, meeting other architects, I realized that this kind of love-hate relationship, it's not just for me. So personally, I feel that architecture and the built environment are still very much part of the problem, as much as our narratives of modern linearity and scientific progress tell us that we're already part of the solution. So I'm very grateful to be here, and it's quite nice to be back at Sheppard Robson. And it's quite nice to share with old friends and new friends how problematic architecture and the built environment are in the respect of climate change. I'm here to share with you a bit of my research and how I think architecture can regenerate and redefine itself within the bigger and wider paradigm shift of climate change. So for a long part of the lecture, I'm not going to make much sense. And I'm just kind of sharing that with you. So I please ask you, bear with me. Towards the end of it, it will all make sense. Because we all had slightly different days, some of us have been maybe spending hours with potential new clients, stretching their empathy muscles, making new friends, establishing new bonds. And maybe some of us have had no empathy at all, maybe administrating a JCT contract. And some others maybe kind of designed toilets in great detail with their empathy instincts left to wonder whether intervene or not. So I would do with you a very quick disconnection and reconnection exercise. I know, you see, your face is just like, wow, crazy. So you're free to close your eyes and let go of the monopoly of sight. Or if you're really thinking, who the hell is this crazy hippie? By all means, don't do that. Keep your eyes open, because who the hell is this crazy hippie should come towards the end of the lecture, not already now. But it is really about disconnecting and kind of restarting from a kind of level playing field. Let's try to kind of be in the same place in terms of perception and consciousness. And the disconnection is from the disconnection of noise. The incredible amount of noise that is constantly distracting us. Voices and conversations we don't really need to listen to, yet we are forced to. So we could disconnect from that noise. We could disconnect from the noise of technology, constantly buzzing in our pockets, distracting us, expecting our full attention, stealing our privacy. So let's imagine we could just disconnect from all that noise. And equally, we could disconnect from pollution, let's say, and the toxicity of the air around Camden Town. Let's try and disconnect from all of that. We don't need all of that. And let's try to disconnect from the social and political violence of hopelessness, which is so evident in Camden Town, and the severity of housing crisis, which somehow architects have something to do with. Let's try to disconnect, let it go. It's not our responsibility for a second. It's not our problem. So let's disconnect from the political chaos of Brexit. Let's disconnect from the issue of climate refugees. Let's disconnect from climate change entirely. It's all gone. For a second, we are the main character of a complete new story. It's the first page of the book, and it's white. We are the main character, and a new narrative is for us to write. So slowly, as we come back from our disconnection, we start to feel our toes again, and our fingers, and the air on the tip of our nose. And we start to reconnect. and we reconnect with our bodies for the first time again. And suddenly we feel our bodies slightly fitter. Still same body, same level, but somewhat fitter. More able to walk, run, and climb. And as we let go of that noise, we start reconnecting our mind. Still the same mind, but somehow slightly more sharp and calm and focused. And we reconnect with people around us. And we reconnect with our work. And suddenly we realize how much purpose we have in our work every day. We reconnect to our communities who are grateful for the work we do. And reconnect with other forms of life around us. Other human beings, other Homo sapiens, but also other forms of life. Like houseplants and pets and bugs and birds and bigger birds and all other wild animals like chimpanzees and cockroaches and whales and entire weather systems and oceans and mountains, the sun, soil, earthworms, flowers, seeds. We reconnect to life and death and life again. I'm just pondering this moment. So what's really interesting is that the need to disconnect and reconnect, as much as this might have felt to you a little bit of a hippie exercise, is one of the most important and crucial aspects to rebalance Western modern lifestyles to what seems to be a pandemic of mental health issues. And in this respect, I would recommend Johan Hari, Los Connections. What also happened as we disconnected from our life and world, we let go of the bonds of modernity and realized that far deeper and stronger bonds tie us with the biosphere. So we have been modern women and men for about 200-300 years, but we have been connected to the biosphere for hundreds of thousands of years. So in a way, the narrative that structures our daily life, it's quite a short one, and it might not be the only narrative. What's quite interesting as a proof of the fact that we still are part of biosphere and connected with those primeval instincts is that every time we are confronted with a beautiful natural landscape, we feel kind of happy. So biophilia is exactly the same instinct that our ancestor, hunter-gatherer, had probably felt some 20,000 years ago. As we look at the beautiful forest ahead of us, that happiness is nothing more than risk management. There is nothing romantic about it. It's the certainty or the statistical chance to find food, shelter, and safety away from predators. That instinct is still hardwired in us. Our fear for spiders and snakes comes from the same experience, hardwired in our DNA and our instinct. The happiness to be surrounded by friends around a fire in a campfire is also with us since long times. And again, there's a beautiful book I recommend, and I will be recommending a few books, and I'm very happy to share my reading list afterwards. It's called Go Wild by John Ratey and Richard Manning. And what these two doctors basically do is they provide hard evidence, the medical scientific fact showing that actually our modern Western lifestyle is literally making us thick, sick and fat. And also they demonstrate how little our bodies and brains have changed from our ancestors, hunters and gatherers. All of this will make sense. So the first point here is that the narrative that structure our daily life might not be the only narrative. And this is what these guys refer to in their book, Go Wild. What's fascinating in other authors in completely different fields, say Jeremy Rifkin in economics, or Georges Monbiot in environmental activism, basically say the same thing. They say that another world is possible because another narrative is possible. And Homo sapiens may reframe their own agency on Earth just following a different narrative. And narrative are absolutely crucial, and we're going to come back to narratives a few points during this lecture. Narratives are, for humans, basically zipped version of data. It is demonstrated that we save energy by remembering narratives rather than trying to remember raw data. So if I say, the king died, the queen died, I'm actually using more memory space than saying the king died and the queen died afterwards because she was sad. Although the second sentence is a lot longer, I'm actually using less space because I'm connecting the two facts in a very emotionally relevant manner. So trying to understand how we build this new narrative, which has to be different from modernity, from the linearity of modernity, it kind of makes sense to go back along our timeline and see where all of this started. And it's quite a fascinating journey. And you wonder, when is this guy going to make sense? And trust me, he will towards the end. So it does help to have an historic perspective of our agency on Earth. And I think it's easier, rather than trying to fathom the relevance of some tribe of hunters and gatherers somewhere in northern Syria, in modern-day Syria, along the kind of Fertile Crescent and about 12,000 years ago, which is quite an abstract thing. It might be easier to start from today. 26th Feb, 2020. Earlier this month, we actually recorded the highest temperature ever recorded in Antarctica, 18.4 degrees. And NASA confirmed that the same day, the same temperature was recorded in Los Angeles, California. From today, if we go back 30 years, we basically find an ever-increasing consensus among scientists in agreeing that climate change, what we are experiencing, is primarily man-made. It's the majority of scientists because a small part of science is mainly funded by fossil fuels companies, have spent huge amounts of money and time arguing the opposite. But I do not believe that by entrenching ourselves in this kind of dialectics between climate skeptics and climate believers, we're going to build this new narrative. There's nothing to believe or disbelieve. We're not talking about God. We're not talking about the sex of angels. We're talking about data. And actually, it's not even us reading the data. It's scientists doing it for us, far better than we could ever do. So there's another beautiful book. This is really one of the most important one I will be quoting tonight, which is Charles Eisenstein's Climate, A New Story. And the main point in the book is that we are not going to build this new narrative, we are not going to build this life raft for humanity if we keep this dialectic, this dualism between opposing forces. And yes, it is true, and Naomi Klein in This Changing Everything tells it really, really well, that ridiculous sums of money have been spending to slowing down reaction to climate change. It is true. Yet it doesn't help us to think that there are goodies and baddies. We're all involved. Our lifestyle, to a greater or lesser extent, is responsible for climate change. Climate change is just the logical consequence of humanity agency on Earth. And architects know this very well. I mean, we use fossil fuels to heat buildings. Less and less, but we still do that. We are wearing more and more synthetic fibers, which come from as a byproduct of oil. We eat food which requires ridiculous amount of fossil fuel-based pesticides, fertilizers. So we kind of swimming in oil. And before us, our great-grandfathers and grandmothers, they bathed in coal. And coal is quite interesting. And the unfolding of the first industrial revolution is the main reason why Western civilization made a great leap forward compared to ancient and very powerful civilizations such as India or China. So in our timeline, we kind of started today and then went back to 30 years, sort of first energy crisis, and now we are back 200, 230 years when coal really started to change our lifestyle. And since climate change is kind of driving species to extinction, and it's like physically making us sicker and posing a threat to life on Earth, we may agree that our relationship to fossil fuels is some sort of toxic addiction. We know it's bad for us, but we still do it. And it's interesting, kind of borrowing a bit of terminology from psychology, to understand where this toxic addiction started. When, in the childhood of humanity, the trauma occurred that created this masochistic behavior. And in order to find that, we need to go back even further on our timeline, because behind climate change, of course, there are fossil fuels. But behind fossil fuels and the requirement for easy access to natural resources, there is the coupling of growth and well-being, which is the fundamental statement underpinning capitalism, which is our economic model, our economic paradigm. The first definition of capitalism as we know it today goes back to some sort of 17th century. So we are going back on our timeline and we see how things are connected, and we're just really connecting the dots. And again, the requirement for easy access to natural resources supported capitalism through another specific behavior, particularly of the West, which is colonialism. Colonialism is the policy through which I guarantee easy access to natural resources, near zero cost, and total monopoly for pricing strategies. So colonialism takes us back some sort of 16th century after Christ. We're talking about Portugal and Spain and France and Holland and the United Kingdom investing huge amounts of money in finding new access to resources. Still, this is not the end of the story, because behind colonialism, there is a far deeper and more spread practice of military invasion. So this goes before colonialism. The practice of just simply invading our neighbors to steal their stuff goes back to the Romans, and before them the Greek, and the Phoenician, and the Egyptians. Underneath that, there is the ethical acceptance of harming another human being. And as a group of people, we may decide that it's perfectly okay to go to the village down the road and kill them all and steal all their resources, because we feel fundamentally different from them. So there is a strong yet invisible line of othering, that defines our identity by difference to anything else surrounding us. Now, the creation of clans and tribes and the definition of a group of humans' identity as different from other groups of humans, it goes back a long way in the biosphere. I mean, primates like chimpanzees and gorillas, have clans and tribes, and they kind of kill each other. So, it's not to say that we are the only one doing that. But what we can say quite, I think, confidently, is that there's a specific moment in history where our own definition or our own identity was bond with othering. And on our timeline, we go back even more, somewhere around 10,000 BC. Again, somewhere around modern-day Syria, in a small tribe of hunters and gatherers that somehow decided to stop their very healthy, although very, very risky, nomadic lifestyle and settle down, build architecture, and learn how to use plants to produce their own food. Now, the reason why this moment is really important is because for the first time we coupled humans with a sense of entitlement and possession over the biosphere. Let's imagine we are a tribe and we really had enough to run around wild beast, and we'll start farming the land. We will feel that our identity is linked to this very specific of land that we farm. It's ours. So if someone comes in, well, we will kill them. And if this land is not enough, we will go out and find more land and we will kill them. What's also more fascinating about the Neolithic agricultural revolution is that really is the moment when humans jump off the wheel, the self-balancing wheel of the biosphere. Hunters and gatherers were part of the biosphere. They were predators and they're prey. So they're part of the cycle. The moment that humans stepped out of that circle and then produced their own food, their survival was only related to the amount of deforestation and the amount of plain flooding they were able to carry out. Of course linked to weather events, but substantially disconnected from the evolution of other animal species. So this is kind of really quite interesting. So we might have found the humanity childhood trauma that has caused our disconnection from the biosphere. We might have found the T0 moment where man and nature split. So what's quite interesting is that as much as going backwards in time, we could reconnect various events and understand where that linearity, that very, very simplistic view of our agency on Earth has started. On the same timeline, coming back to the future, we can also find the traces of the new narrative, which, if we decide to embrace, we may prove as vital in the context of climate change. What's quite interesting is that, and I'm quoting another really interesting book called The Sixth Mass Extinction by Elizabeth Colbert, is that as humans settled, as they jumped off the wheel of biosphere, they also wiped out a ridiculous number of other animals. So the large fauna just disappeared. Large numbers of other forms of life also were gone. Because truly, since that moment, some 12,000 years ago, we thought that humans can quite happily destroy forests and kill animals and flood plains and make species extinct and change the balance of ecosystem, altering the average temperature in Antarctica and getting away with it. Because our narrative, the story that structures our daily agency on Earth, is based on the fact that humanism, our intelligence, is the supreme value. We will sort it out. We don't need to engage with the complexity of Earth. We will sort it out. Something will happen and we'll get it right. In fact, climate change is showing that we're not getting it right. And even the prediction of the IPCC report showing that if our worst expectations of the last 20 years prove to be actually quite optimistic. So we're kind of losing the game at the moment. So it might be time to start this new narrative. So on the way back, we kind of connected the dots of capitalism, colonialism, sedentary lifestyles, and Neolithic agricultural revolution. And then on the way back from modern-day Syria in 12,000 years ago, we are now finding a new story of connection, a new story of complexity. In my research, one of the most important authors is Jeremy Rifkin, and I've read several books, and I would say the one that's most relevant in this moment is probably The Empathic Civilization. It's absolutely a doorstopper, but it's absolutely worth reading. What basically he argues in The Empathic Civilization is that humanity has made great leap forward in consciousness. Every time a leap forward in energy production and communications concurred. So human consciousness, in other words, moved from being mythological, i.e. we believed that there was a godlike power behind every single phenomenon in nature to a monotheistic consciousness where we use the very handy philosophical aid of a single God to explain everything in nature. As humanism took in and scientific revolutions gave us more and more evidence of how things actually work, we kind of replaced partially the very handy idea of God with humans themselves. Humanism is really the most powerful narrative that we believe to, we adhere to for a long time. Getting very close now, back on our timeline, we get close to the aftermath of World War II. But absolutely catastrophic effects of humanity are evident, and were evident to everyone around us. So that faith in humanity left on their own started to shake a little bit. Psychological consciousness gave then more interesting insight of how our brain works and how our brain can be deceived and how not perfect maybe we are. But even psychological consciousness, Rifkin argues, is missing out a fundamental point in what makes us humans. We relate. We came first in the race among other hominids because we relate, we create networks, we help each other, we empathize. So Rifkin's story really is a story of empathy. And the more empathy we can feel, and the larger is our domain of feelings, the more we're getting closer to biosphere. What's really quite interesting, as much as Rifkin kind of moved between anthropology and sociology and economics, other authors do kind of similar journey in completely different disciplines. Harari, in history, basically argues that humans are deceived by their own narratives. And it's only now with the emergence of parallel computing, so computers and AI, that we need to let go of narratives. Maybe there is no purpose in life. Maybe there is no meaning in our big narratives. Maybe it's just about randomness and statistics. Harari is a great author, so if you haven't read, I would recommend both Homo Deus and Sapiens. And basically that is his story. But what's quite fascinating is that beyond economics, sociology, and history, another author really specified in mathematics and physics is called James Gleick, kind of says the same thing. There's a beautiful book called Chaos. What it does is a very simple history of chaos theory. And it's quite recent. It only started like mid-60s, sorry. And then in the 70s, from mathematics kind of spread to physics, and from physics to kind of meteorology, really, and then medicine, and then ecology. Again, what's interesting, what kind of shook the community of physics and maths and all these other disciplines in those years was the fact that there is no purpose, there is no regularity. Consistent lack of regularity can emerge from a regular set of equations. Rifkin in sociology, Harari in history, Gleick in physics and ecology, they're all kind of saying the same thing. Reality is about complexity. For so long, we believed that it was about linearity, that our anthropological power, our intelligence could sort out everything. And the long lines of our supply chains just explain even more clearly how wrong we've been for so long. What's quite fascinating as well in the transition between linearity to complexity is that complexity equally applies to digital and natural environment. Furthermore, ecologies and complex systems tends to automation. Ask Jeff Bezos. Or look at a forest. A forest is a fantastically energy efficient system. It's fully automated. Energy comes from the sun, it's transformed into food, plants grow, herbivores eat plants, carnivores eat herbivores. Bigger and bigger carnivores climb up their way into the food chain. At the end, the top of the food chain is only regulated by the availability of food. Dead animals and waste get immediately recycled. And now let's look at the corresponding system effect of modern linearity. Let's say monoculture. So first, huge amount of energy is required to destroy the protective layer that the soil naturally has that prevents direct radiation to impoverish the soil itself. Then energy is required to artificially plant seed. Then more energy is required to water the seeds. Then more energy-intensive pesticides and fertilizers are required for genetically modified seeds to grow. And then more energy is required to harvest the food, package the food, deliver the food, consume the food, and dispose of the waste emerging from this line. So we see how the linearity of modernity really just leaves behind CO2, energy, and waste. And now the circularity of even the simplest natural environment, like a forest, leaves no spare energy, no waste, and no CO2. So we may agree that the task is to move from lines to circles. And speaking to an audience of architects, this shouldn't come any easier. It is about circles, yes. The point is that our system, our linear system, our complex, interconnected, layered system of lines has grown to a ridiculous, cumbersome magnitude. It's very difficult to change. The resistance that governments and businesses find, or maybe indulge with, in changing from linearity to complexity is the effect that themselves, they are the product of that narrative. So as my good friend Ed Gillespie, who is a lead environmentalist and sustainability consultant, says, the ship is too big. We can't turn it in time. It's ineffective from a cost and time point of view to turn the ship before we hit the rocks of runaway climate change. Better to use the resources we have on board to build agile, small life rafts and live the ship to sink. One way or another, we need to change our narrative because, as Einstein kind of said, insanity is to expect different result from the same set of questions. So the rise of kind of pan-species empathy and the application of complex system intelligence to our agency on Earth call for a complete redefinition of our disciplines. And as our architect, as the people who deliver the built environment that produces 40% of our CO2, we are responsible every day either to turn the ship or rather to build the life raft. So we went down in history, understanding how the long history of othering took us back to the dualism between man and nature. And we came back from history, realizing how the emergence of a complexity and empathy gave us a great opportunity to reconnect, as we did at the beginning. We disconnected and reconnected. So the game now is, how do we reconnect? Because it is certain that there is complexity out there that we don't yet understand. James Lovelock called it Gaia, the idea of a sentient organism spread across the entirety of the planet. Whether you call it Gaia, posthumanism, or simply biosphere, our role as an architect in our contextual complex system is to heal the dualism between man and nature through our practice. Slowly, it's bloody making sense. Because what's quite fascinating is that by virtue of his own definition, nature is everything but mankind. And mankind is everything but nature. But Anthropocene, i.e. the changing of the geological balance of Earth through man-made action, changes everything. Because if we changed the geological balance of Earth, then there is no nature anymore. It's all human. But empirical evidence shows that it's not just us in the world. We're not alone. There is other complexity. So perhaps both nature and mankind need to be redefined. And within this redefinition, architecture can find the energy and the spin to totally rediscover itself and redefine itself. So, my wife Julia, as poor thing, had to witness all this rehearsal. At this point said, right, just questions, just make it tangible, because great, but... And I did it, because she's always right. So let's imagine this new discipline, which can't be called architecture anymore, and we can't be called women and men anymore. We need to redefine all of this. So how will we design buildings that act as natural reserves? How will we design a photosynthetic transport network? How will we design housing, which really should be called living space, for all forms of life? Not the ecologists, not the park rangers, us. How will we design a hospital that heals both humans and soil? How will we design high-rise, mixed-use buildings that will have the same environmental impact as a mature forest? Think automation. How will we couple the retrofitting of existing building stock with the healing of compromised ecosystems? And how will we treat waste as a truly circular, automated, complex system? So thank you for bearing with me until now. So humans have thought that the power of their linear intelligence granted them God-like powers on Earth. Climate change proves that the situation is definitely more complex than what we thought. As architect of our own future and the future of life on Earth, the chance is ours to go back to the drawing board and step up our game. Thank you.